Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Descartes and Pascal on God. In our last video, we discussed Descartes' rationalist epistemology. That included both his epistemological categories, namely clarity and distinctness, but also his account of our cognitive faculties, the imagination and the understanding. Today, we're going to expand on those topics by explaining some of Descartes' thoughts on the nature of God. Descartes would, I think, quite fairly claim that most people have what he would call an imaginative relationship to God. In other words, when we think about God, we picture God. Namely, we picture God as perhaps an old man with a flowy white beard in the sky, right? Who's able to do anything that he would want to do, and so on, right? We imagine God as our Savior. We imagine God as listening to our prayers, and so on. This is, I think, a straightforward and very widespread conception of God. Descartes is going to argue, contrary to this ordinary conception of God, that we actually cannot picture God. In other words, we cannot imagine God. If we form an imaginative representation of God, then we have an unclear and indistinct idea of God, namely as someone like more powerful than us, or a spirit, or something of this nature. Descartes thinks that philosophy is necessary for us to acquire a clear and distinct idea of God, and that is necessary, as we shall see, for a true Christian religion. The relationship between Descartes' thought and religion is a really vexing and quite interesting topic. Just to say some biographical information, Descartes was himself clearly concerned with the possibility of persecution. He witnessed Galileo go on house arrest in the early 17th century. And he himself was worried about how church authorities would view his philosophical writings. Now, some might conclude from that Descartes' claims to bolster the Christian religion are therefore completely bunk, that he's dissimulating. In other words, he's hiding his true beliefs and just giving it some Christian window dressing. Other people want to say that he's completely sincere in his commitment to Christian religion. And finally, other people might say, for example, that he's committed to the Christian religion, but he's also committed to what we could call a rational interpretation of the Christian religion, which might differ from Orthodox Christianity in some important ways. Now, to get a handle on Descartes' understanding of God, and as we've said, he's rejected an account according to which we know God through the imagination, through picturing God in various kinds of ways. Instead, he's going to maintain that to truly know God is to understand God, or to understand why it is that God exists, to understand the essential nature of God. And in the Meditations, Descartes gives two arguments that he thinks are knockdown arguments for why God exists. These arguments are regularly referred to as the Cartesian argument for the existence of God, because it is original to Descartes, and the ontological argument for the existence of God, which you may or may not be familiar with, but is a far more common and widespread argument that preceded Descartes for the existence of God, that he ends up endorsing within the Meditations. Let's go through the Cartesian argument for the existence of God first. Descartes makes this argument in the third meditation. This is the first thing that Descartes endeavors to prove after giving the cogito argument, which is going to be the foundation of his philosophical system. If he can prove that God exists and that God, according to God's nature, is absolute perfection, this is an idea that we will discuss more in a moment, then we can know that he is not a deceiver, and that accordingly the third skeptical argument of the first meditation is false. That Descartes entertained the idea of an evil genius or an evil demon or an evil deceiver, but that the existence of such a creature would actually be inconsistent with God's nature. So in other words, by proving the existence of God, Descartes is going to get back the a priori arguments that he didn't have previously. Descartes' argument is, I think, somewhat simplified in the way that I've written up here on the board. Now, the first premise, this is the one that's going to take up most of our time. It's quite controversial, at least in some respects, and it's going to come up again and again as we proceed through this semester. This is the principle of sufficient reason, otherwise known as the PSR. Simply stated, what the principle of sufficient reason says is that for any event, there is a cause for that event. Now, in a way, principle of sufficient reason sounds like really highfalutin philosophical terminology, right? But, for example, if you heard a loud crash somewhere else in your room or your apartment or wherever it is that you are, you naturally, immediately, and without doing any philosophy at all, immediately presume, well, there must have been something that caused that crash, and you investigate accordingly. The principle of sufficient reason is really just a statement of the general nature of that insight, which is that things in the world don't just pop up out of nowhere, they're not caused by nothing, but instead, for any event that takes place in the universe, we can locate a cause for that event. This is going to be very, very important in the development of modern philosophy, especially rationalist philosophy, and underlies not only the philosophy of this period, but also the sciences, right? The sciences embrace the idea that, if a planet moves in such a way, then there's a reason for why it does so, a reason that natural science has the tools to investigate. So Descartes' first premise for the Cartesian argument is just this principle, which he thinks is going to be non-controversial, namely just things that happen in the universe have a cause, right? Now, the second premise of Descartes' argument, he also takes to be basically uncontroversial, which is that we have an idea of the infinite, right? We have an idea, I have a limited degree of capacities, I can imagine something, or I have the idea of something that overcomes all of those limits. We regularly identify this infinite thing as God, right? But Descartes isn't quite there yet. He just wants to say that we have an idea of the infinite, which I think that basically everyone is willing to grant. Now, where things get very controversial is in the third premise. In the third premise, Descartes says, per the principle of sufficient reason and the second premise, the idea of the infinite that we have within us cannot have a finite cause. So in other words, while, for example, I might, in my own experience, come across something larger than me, imposing to me, maybe a giant boulder or something like that, right? Something that exceeds my capacities in various ways, right? I don't have the ability to move, for example, the boulder. I cannot gain from any finite things, even finite things that are greater than me in some respect, the idea of the infinite. In other words, the infinite cannot itself have a finite cause. People disagree often about whether Descartes' reasoning here is accurate. And I very much look forward to hearing what you all think about this argument. Descartes infers from the fact that our idea of the infinite can't come from any finite thing. It also can't be something that I just made up in my head, because I too am a finite thing. Descartes infers from the fact that our idea of the infinite, per the principle of sufficient reason, cannot have a finite cause, for the same reason that, a 120 mile per hour velocity pitch can't come from my arm, right? I don't have the amount of force necessary to throw such a pitch, right? For the same reason, the idea of the infinite can't come from anything finite, and therefore it must have a cause that precedes all of this finite stuff, namely the infinite, aka God. As I mentioned, people disagree about whether or not Descartes' argument he provides in the Cartesian argument is very good or not. But let's also examine the ontological argument so that we can get a sense for another of Descartes' arguments for the existence of God. We can explain this argument relatively simply. It starts off with the first premise, that God is absolute perfection. Now, it's important to emphasize that this premise is not controversial. Descartes is not yet asserting that something absolutely perfect, aka God, exists. He's instead saying that our concept of God, what we're debating about, what we're examining whether or not exists, is something that is absolutely perfect. In other words, perfect in every respect. This is where we get sort of the traditional definition of God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Omniscient means that God knows everything. Omnipotent means God can do everything. And omnibenevolent means that God has goodwill towards everything, or that God has a supremely good will, right? God is morally perfect, in addition to being maximally powerful and maximally knowledgeable. The term absolute perfection is meant to signal just that in all the ways that we could examine God and normatively appraise him, that God is perfect in all of those ways. So the question now is to determine whether or not such a being really exists, right? And the way that the ontological argument goes about proving this is it tries to say that existence is a perfection, right? And here is a relatively simple and short argument to that effect. Would you rather have an imaginary $100 that I can give to you, or I can give you an actually existent $20 bill, right? Which would you prefer? Most people, I think, most rational people, would prefer the actual $20 bill over the non-existent $100 bill. In other words, the actual $20 bill is more perfect. It has a greater capacity to act as money than the imaginary $100 bill. Consequently, To exist, according to this view, is a perfection. Alongside other perfections, other qualities about that thing, one thing to examine is whether or not it exists, right? And me, the penny that does exist, is more perfect, at least in that respect, than other possible pennies that do not exist. Now, they want to conclude from the fact that God is the being under examination, that being is absolutely perfect and therefore has the highest amount of any possible perfection, and that existence is a perfection, that you must know just from the concept of God that God exists. Now, the reasoning for this argument is supposed to be modeled on geometry, at least in some important respect. What rationalist thinkers generally during this period are going to say to you, if you are, a free thinker or an atheist and you doubt the existence of God, is they're going to say, well, you have an inadequate conception of God, if that question even occurs to you, right? In the same way, they would like to say that if you said, I have the idea of a four-sided triangle, or a four-angled triangle, or a triangle whose interior angles do not add up to 180 degrees on a two-dimensional surface, then they would just say, no, you actually don't have an idea of what a triangle is at all, because it belongs to the essential nature of a triangle to be a three-sided polygon whose interior angles add up to 180 degrees when placed on a flat two-dimensional surface. In other words, just like it's the essence of a triangle to have three sides, so too it belongs to the essence of God and God alone to exist. From this point, we've received two arguments sort of modeled on demonstrations within mathematics, which attempt to show why we can know with absolute certainty that God exists. Where we need to go now is into the controversies that these arguments produced. And this is why I also had you read that small selection by Blaise Pascal. Pascal is a fascinating philosopher in his own right. I so wish that we had more time during the semester to discuss his thoughts in more depth. He's quite worthy. I mean, he is an amazing mathematician. One of the first computer science languages was named after Pascal. People say that Pascal anticipated the development of game theory and so on. So Pascal was a very smart cookie and a rough contemporary of Descartes. Now, Pascal was sharply critical of Descartes, and especially critical of Descartes when Descartes tries to provide these philosophical arguments for the existence of God. And Pascal's reasoning here is that Descartes isn't really a Christian, right? Maybe Descartes believes in the existence of something else that he calls God, the philosopher's God. But this is different than the conception of God that you receive from the Christian religion. This is going to drive a wedge between philosophy and theology. Recall that in Descartes' dedicatory letter to the Sorbonne, which is that what begins our reading in Descartes, Descartes says that his aim is to provide philosophical demonstrations of certain articles of religion, namely the existence of God and the soul, that he thinks don't presume anything in the way of theology. So Descartes' express intention is to produce a philosophical argument that could persuade atheists and non-believers. In other words, philosophy is meant to support theology. It's meant to provide independent, rational evidence for the conclusions reached by theology. And this is why Descartes thought about his work and presented his work as championing the Christian religion. Now, Pascal's point that he makes in this short reading that I had you do, where he says that we know God only through Jesus Christ, is that the religious conception of God, expressed by theology, is distinct from the philosophical conception of God that we receive through the ontological and Cartesian arguments. The Christian conception of God is fundamentally mysterious, right? God sacrificed his only begotten Son. God does things that are rationally inexplicable according to certain stories from the Bible and so on, right? Whereas Descartes' God is purely rational. And for Pascal, it seems as though Descartes is trying to judge the existence of God from purely human, rational standards. Whereas God, as the absolutely infinite, is above our capacity for rational understanding. I'm really interested to know what you all think. Do you agree with Descartes that his arguments provide rational support for Christian belief? Or do you agree with Pascal when he says that Descartes is doing the equivalent of inventing an entirely new philosophical religion that really has no relationship to Christianity whatsoever? Next week, we're going to be discussing Descartes' dualism in a lot more depth than we've been able to do up to this point. So Descartes' theory about bodies and minds and the nature of mind-body relationship. I very much look forward to hearing what you think, and I will see you next week.